Well, hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Heather Cleary, a translator from Spanish and a member of the Translators Collective Cedilla and Company. We're delighted to be collaborating with the Center for Fiction to bring you this monthly series and are grateful for the center's support. These translation clinics are intended as a knowledge-sharing open sessions for translators and lovers of translation from all backgrounds and experience levels. Each month, we invite a different literary translator to present on or discuss a subject of their choice with a Cedilla member, followed by a Q&A with the attendees. Topics may range from questions and theories of craft to submissions, contracts, and other practical concerns, always with an eye to literary translation as a profession. Attendees are encouraged to bring questions from their own practice. These sessions will be recorded and available for later viewing. Live captioning is also available. You can click on the CC button on the bottom menu for various options. We invite you to turn your camera on if you like and settle in for the conversation, during which everyone except Katrina and myself will be muted. Feel free to add comments and questions in the chat, which tonight will be moderated by Cedilla member Jeremy Tiang, a writer and translator from Chinese. For the second half of the session, we'll open the conversation. If you're comfortable speaking on screen, raise your hand either by clicking at the bottom on the participants list or by using the reactions button, and you'll be invited to unmute your microphone and ask the question yourself. Or if you prefer, Jeremy can read your question. Please just send it privately to Cedilla in the chat. We'll try to get to all of them, but we apologize in advance if we run out of time. For those who are unable to attend our live events, we encourage you to email questions or comments before or after the sessions to translationclinics@centerforfiction.org, and that address will be posted later in the chat. We hope to make these conversations ongoing to include viewers in as many time zones as possible. And now let's dive in. Today, we have the good fortune to hear from Katrina Dodson, who is the translator of Complete Stories by Cleary, winner of the Penn Translation Prize, among other awards. She is currently adapting her Lispector translation journal into a book and translating the 1928 Brazilian modernist classic Macunaíma, The Hero with No Character, by Mário de Andrade, which will be published by New Directions in the fall of 2022. Her writing has appeared in the Paris Review, The Believer, McSweeney's, and elsewhere. Dodson holds a PhD in comparative literature from the University of California at Berkeley and teaches translation at Columbia University. Tonight, we'll be talking about how experienced translators and those just starting out can build and continually renew their own philosophies of translation, and how different projects require making and breaking certain rules. So to get started, Katrina, would you tell us a little bit about how you got started translating and some of the texts that have served as guideposts for you?
Sure, and I just wanted to say thank you to the Center for Fiction, which is a special place for me because I spent a lot of time in their writer's studio before the pandemic shut things down. And thank you to Cedilla and Company for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be able to participate in this series. I think, most translators are self-taught. So I teach in an MFA program now, and I've taught in other MFA programs for the past 5 years. And I think, I just want to say to a lot of people out there who are not doing an MFA that the best way to learn to translate is to just jump in and start doing it. And I started doing it. I was in graduate school for comparative literature. And I met a literary agent who asked me to do a reader's report and for a book in translation. And that was the first time I really thought about translation as an actual kind of profession you could do, which is kind of crazy because being in comparative literature, I rely on translations to teach my courses, of literature in translation, but I just, I hadn't really thought about it as something I could do. And so that gave me the idea. And I started with 2 young Brazilian writers who I met at a Brazilian literary festival. And then, I just started translating more. And that's, I could tell that's a kind of a whole nother story, but basically, I wanted to talk about how, as I was translating, I felt like I was a really good reader of literature, but I didn't really know what I was doing translating. And my Portuguese was really good. My English was really good, but I just wasn't, I had all these questions come up. So I think that, the best way, to just jump in and start translating, you will start having all kinds of dilemmas that come up for you. And two texts that I've found really useful at the beginning to just kind of start dipping my toe in was the Translation Studies Reader, um, edited by Lawrence Venuti. And I've asked Jeremy I sent him a bunch of links and just names. So he's gonna put the text that I talk about in the chat, but I'll just show these to show and tell. For this one, it's just, it's more academic, but it gives a really solid historical overview of shifts in translation practices and philosophies from previous centuries up to the 90s, which is a previous century. And then the other one that I really recommend is In Translation. So that's edited by Susan Bernofsky and Esther Allen. And what I like about this one is that it is more in the vein of practical philosophy with essays by translators. So it mixes specific approaches and solutions to kind of broader explanations of translation philosophies. I also watched just a ton of panels with translators and read whatever interviews with translators that I could find. And one that I found incredibly helpful to this day, and I send it to my students, is this Retranslating Literary Classics panel at Columbia with Edith Grossman, Richard Pevere, and Larissa Volokonsky, who retranslated Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and Wyatt Mason, who was translating Montaigne. And Edith Grossman is known for her many things in Spanish, but she was talking about retranslating Don Quixote. So, sometimes you have questions, like I wasn't sure if I was allowed to look at previous translations because I was translating Clarice Lispector and about 2/3 of the book had been translated before. And so everyone admitted that they did look at the previous translations, but only at the very, very end, or maybe you use it like kind of like a dictionary or kind of like sanity check. And so I think it's just like answering all these little questions that you can't figure out alone. These were really great ways. I'd also recommend two kind of series that are online is the Translating the Future conference from Penn, and then the Translation Now conference from Boston University. And Jeremy's putting those in the chat. Also the American Literary Translators Association, ALTA annual conference. Now so many things are on Zoom. And I would just go to a lot of, events, reading series. I like the Us and Them reading series. And then Susan Bernofsky used to have she has the website Translationista, but she doesn't update as much. But the Columbia now has a whole list of translation events. So, those are just some things. These are for people who are just dipping their toe in. So those were kind of ways that I got started educating myself on these questions of, like, what is translation? How do we do it? And I think one of the reasons I proposed this topic for today was that in my teaching, this was kind of a constant that came up of how do we create our own philosophies of translation that are constantly evolving as we encounter new ideas and new perspectives. I definitely read translation theory. I find manifestos very invigorating, but I don't really use them as a blueprint for translating. So I think that's why I proposed this as a kind of talk about a practical philosophy of translation, because I think it's important to have a vision of where you're going and what you're doing, and to kind of have a system and a consciousness that you make your decisions from, but without it being overly ideological, because the work of art, each individual work of art will really require sometimes a brand new system. So, and I came across this passage. I was teaching the art critic John Berger this semester, and he has an essay on the German Renaissance painter Albrecht Dürer, whose father was a Hungarian goldsmith. And Berger makes this distinction between the medieval craftsman and the Renaissance artist, which I thought was really relevant for how people think about translation as, on the level of this kind of like craft. And so, what Berger says is, for the medieval craftsman, Berger writes, all he had to ask himself concerning his work was how. no other questions pose themselves for him. However, for the Renaissance artist, the first question in terms of art is whither? Where do I go? And so I think, obviously, the question of process and craft is really important for translators, but I think, we have to know our tools, languages, inside and out. But I think that as artists, we really need to ask larger questions about where we're going in our work and why, and start to kind of create this consciousness of translation that's more than just a word for word transaction. It's not a mechanical process. It involves a lot of imagination and intuition and just a certain awareness of your practice. And so, I wrote down some questions. I think, I had some questions that are really important to ask yourself as you inform your overall vision. So, just on the basic level is, how do I understand what translation is and what it's meant to do? That's just, the answers to that are endless. How do I choose what to translate is another one. And I think, most of us first choose a text because we've fallen in love with it for some reason. And we want to understand it more intimately. We want to share it with other people. But I think as we press forward, we really should reflect more on, why we want to translate certain texts or authors over others, what our priorities are. And, with each text, I think, we have to ask, so what's the relationship between this work and a particular people or history? So thinking in terms of literary, cultural, political history, what are the strengths and affinities that I bring to the translation? What are my blind spots and limitations in relation to this project? And how do I remedy those? And I think that's where research comes in. That's where I think kind of casting a wide network of asking people maybe who are native speakers, talking to maybe academics, talking to people who just love literature, talking to people from different backgrounds, to really kind of compensate for those things that you might not be able to really have a kind of a better intuition about. Another really important question, I think, is what and whom am I responsible when translating the text? It's not just about your personal love of the text. So these are these kind of bigger questions after that first glow of like, oh, I love this, like I just want to share it with everybody. And then another question I ask is, how do I understand the work in its original context? And then in the new context that I'm bringing it into. So often we have to bridge these gaps of knowledge. And I think part of that philosophy part is figuring out where is your responsibility to bridge certain gaps. If it's a really famous book in its home country, are you going to have to bridge some gap and it's like a totally unknown author, in the US, for example? Is that part of your responsibility? Or maybe it's not. I don't think there's any one answer to these questions, but you have to know what your answer is. And related to that, I ask, how do I frame this text for a new audience? Will I do it in the book itself, or will I do it outside the book, say in essays or interviews? I think there are a place for what are called paratexts, like the introduction or translator's notes. Sometimes I do footnotes, sometimes I won't do footnotes. So you have to know, kind of have a sense. But I do think I tend to take a more active role of framing the text. I think it's because I do a lot of kind of more canonical dead authors. If I were doing a contemporary author, you still have to bridge the gaps, but I think sometimes there's less that you feel you have to do in terms of kind of filling in certain literary history. So.
Can I jump in?
Sure, please.
It was so interesting what you just said. And I wonder if you could give us an example of a time that you chose to use footnotes or maybe resisted the footnote or some kind of example about those paratexts.
Yeah, so I have, so I think, for example, with the Clarissa Spector book, there's something like 4 footnotes in like 630 pages and, like 85 stories, but her work is very psychological, and there were things I didn't feel that I really had to fill in the Brazilian context for that book. Although, you know, the editor wrote an introduction and I wrote a translator's note. And I insisted, I asked to, I'd seen that Idrinovi did it. So not all the Lispector translators did it, but I saw that Idrinovi, who translated The Passion According to GH, did write a translator's note. And I thought, I've spent so much time with this book, and people are going to have really specific questions about the translation, I thought, because her work is famously kind of, you know, strange in its own context, and the language is very stylized. And so, and I also just wanted to have a voice after spending so much time with the text that was outside of the text. So I did a translator's note. I didn't mind the footnotes, and the places I put footnotes were for when there was a pun. I wrote them down. You know, like there's one story called Uma Esperança, and it's a play on a word that can mean hope, but also is the name of a cricket. And I just thought, well, I'm not going to change the name. You know, I'm just going to call the story A Hope, and, you know, had a footnote. And then the only other place with footnotes, I'm looking for where I wrote this down, because here it is. It's in I think it's like the last story, One Day Less. And there's a joke. So the character's name is Margarida Flores, which means daisy flowers. And so there's this whole play on her name. It's like Margarida Flores de Enterro, Margarida Flores de Jardim. So it goes daisy funeral flowers, daisy garden flowers, Margarida Flores de Bosques Floridos, daisy flowers of the flowering woods. And so, you know, we put that as a footnote, but the story came out in Harper's, and they said, we don't do footnotes. So can we just change her name to Daisy Flowers? And, you know, I think this question of like domestication versus foreignization is a big, I mean, that was something I wanted to talk about. That's a big kind of discussion topic in translation studies. So, you know, domestication would be Daisy Flowers, foreignization is Margarita Flores. And I actually don't, I don't ever say like, am I foreignizing or am I domesticating? I think those can be really reductive terms. But in that moment, I thought, well, in the story, they talk about being in Brazil and that they're specifically not having tea time in England. And I said, Daisy Flowers, that just changes it into Catherine Mansfield or Virginia Woolf's story. You know, it's somewhere else, whereas I want people to know that it's in Brazil. She should have a Brazilian name. And so our compromise was that there was a prefatory note explaining some of the things in the text. So those are some of the things. For Macunaíma, which is a much different text, that's a project I'm working on now. It's an experimental modernist text. It's like nearly incomprehensible. There's so much, there's like the major indigenous language Tupi mixed with Brazilian Portuguese, and there's so many references. Like if I did footnotes, it would be like, that would be in a whole other project. It would be like half the page of footnotes. And so to me, that book was written kind of as a delirium. So I wanted to give people a chance to just read it whole. If you want to just jump in there and not understand anything, I wanted to give you the opportunity to do that. So my choice for that was to have no footnotes, but I also felt like I wanted to translate a kind of accumulated history of the book. So the way it's read in Brazil now, people have a lot of the notes of all the references. You know, it's like Ulysses, like James Joyce. There's so much stuff that's ungoogleable, and I'm doing a ton of research. And I think the kind of histories that the book points to are fascinating. And I think kind of change the book from like, if somebody didn't know the Brazilian context, they would just think, oh, this is just an absurdist like romp through the jungle. You know, it's just like, how silly. And I think it's a really serious book on many levels, and it's like brilliance, genius. And I think that I know that many people will not see that if I don't give them a little bit more of the background. So in that book, and I didn't feel the need to do that for Lispector, but for Macunaíma, I'm doing endnotes, but I'm not doing any numbers, like no marks in the novel itself. It's just kind of like chapter by chapter endnotes. So, and that's not something I would do for a text normally, but again, like Mário de Andrade, he was a poet, but he was also a scholar. So, you know, he just had, he just did an intense amount of research. So to me, even though he didn't publish the book with all these notes, to me, it is true to his spirit as a scholar and the spirit of how Brazilians today read the book and all the things available to them. So, yeah.
Would you?
But I wanted to give. Oh, go on.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, thinking along these lines of, how do you, like, these kind of like macro questions of, like, what is translation and informing your overall vision. I wanted to give a few examples of some, beyond the foundational text, but just texts that I found really helpful for expanding the vision of, what translation can be. One of them, and this is, Jeremy will put these in, Anita Raya, Translation as a Practice of Acceptance, and Erin Murray, Fidelity Was Never My Aim, but Felicity, in her book, My Beloved Wager. That one's a little bit harder to find, but these are two essays that I find kind of as ways to get past the anguish that many beginning translators feel about, like, oh, what's being lost, or oh, like, this is a betrayal, and like, how can I ever be as good as the text itself? And I think these are both kind of essays that really tap into the role of the imagination and the translator's freedom. It's not like we're just freewheeling doing whatever unless it's an experimental text, but I think it's really important to own your role as a creator, as a translator. So those two are really great. Two that I think are really great for thinking about kind of your arc, like your project as a translator, and how your work can extend beyond just like one book, is John Keane, Translating Poetry, Translating Blackness, which is, I know a lot of people know and love this essay, but it's a really great essay for thinking about, so many things, but one of the threads is thinking about how translating different Black authors is really kind of creating a sense, a broader and richer sense of a particular diaspora. And I think, it's not every translator thinks this way, but there is a certain amount of kind of like representation or kind of filling in different gaps in literary history or cultural history. Also, the kitchen table translation issue of Asterix Journal, edited by Madhu Kaza, who did the last talk, yay! Jeremy's holding it up. This is an issue dedicated to translators who also identify as immigrants or children of immigrants. I did an interview talking about being part Vietnamese, but then somehow translating Brazilian literature. Two from Ugly Duckling Press that I think are really great for just, they're more kind of like manifesto style, but I think it's good, even if you can't figure out how you're going to practically translate, it's good to just open your ideas. So Dami Che is so amazing. She has a pamphlet, Translation is a Mode, Translation is an Anti-Neo-Colonial Mode. I also love her writing about her translations of a Korean poet, Kim Hai-soon. So I gave Jeremy a link to an interview she did at the Asian American Writers Workshop. And then Sawako Nakayasu is another person I think is just so creative as a translator and a writer. Say Translation is Art. And then the last one that's a little bit better known is This Little Art, the book by Kate Briggs, which I think, it's just amazing for thinking of the day-to-day of the translator's life and what it is we think we're doing. So yeah, so those are some. I know I got an eye on time. The main other thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of philosophy was, when you get to a particular text, what are ways that you can come up with the kind of system or logic or ethos from which you will make decisions about the translation of this particular author, particular text, but always being able to break away in the moment, because I think that's something we always have to hold on to, the spontaneity, and that's why I call it practical philosophy. It's a little flexible, but I think I gave my spiel about how I think the whole like domestication, foreignization debate is a little bit kind of just reductive. Even though I think it's important, to not translate João as John and to open up space for, I think there should be room in translations for literary ambiguity. I think, most of us here do. But, there also should be space for words and terms that are known in the original context that aren't known in the new context. But at the same time, I don't believe in just being totally against fluidity in a text. I'm against fluidity for the sake of fluidity, but I think sometimes you want something to read in a really streamlined way. And so, some questions, well, yeah, Heather and I talked about this, but one, a question I ask over, like, am I foreignizing or domesticating is, what's the pace of reading that's required here? So, I often ask about a text, what are the main qualities of this passage? What's the effect that it's having, that I think it's having? What drives this effect? Is it the language, the rhythm, the humor? Is it the voice? And how can I best produce some kind of similar effect? And so, with the pace of reading question, I think there's sometimes, it's not so much about the language, like you're just trying to put an image whole in someone else's head. And that means making the language as kind of unremarkable as possible. Sometimes you just want an action, like a description. You want to describe a house or a room in a house. You want a very particular image. And in those cases, I want to do what I can to get the image or the action across. Is there a certain dramatic momentum? Like, is it an action part in a novel? Like, you want that to read fast. So in that case, I am going to do something that's more like conventional English. But, if it's a slow moment, are we meant to pause? Is it very emotional? Is it lyrical? Is it meant to be strange? In those moments, is there a deliberate snag? That's when I want to make something strange, but also not just haphazardly strange, like strange in the way that the original some kind of equivalent. Another way to think about this is marked versus unmarked language. And that's a linguistics term. Heather and I were talking, we're like, well, I don't know where this comes from. It's like, oh, it's linguistics. I think we're using it in a kind of looser way, but, marked language is language that is, that deviates from the norm a little bit, and unmarked is kind of, it reads quickly, it's more conventional language. So again, if something has a lot of marked language, I try to do something similar. And Heather, I know that you said that's one of the guidelines that you use.
Absolutely. And I was just thinking, when you were describing the kind of conflicting drives in approaching a translation, it reminded me actually a little bit of the examples that you brought from the Cleary. If you wanted to do that, or we could just continue talking, but
I could show that, and then hopefully just before we do the Q&A, I could just do like a little snippet of Makunaima because it's so different. But yeah, I will share.
And we'll be opening up to questions after, so start thinking about what you might want to ask.
Okay, sharing. Is it working? Jeremy, I can see you. Will you give a thumbs up? Yeah, okay. Okay, so this is an example. I give a lot, but I think it's so telling. So, my guidelines, kind of my philosophy of translation for Clarice the Spectre was make it strange, because, not just because, but she sounded kind of foreign in her own language, but in a really subtle way. So it's not aggressively, like not every sentence is strange, but she just puts commas in where you don't expect them. And there's just like word choices that throw you off. They don't stop you completely, but you slow down. And so it was important for me to capture her rhythm, because I think with her, she slows you down with something that's a very strange way to say it. And you kind of have this like cognitive moments of difficulty, but the rhythm pulls you along. There's something very kind of incantatory about the rhythm. So in this, just for time, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this is a moment in the story, Love, and it's a moment where the woman's, Anna is having a bit of an emotional breakdown, where her emotional breakdown is causing the world around her to also break down. So she's on the tram, and it says, junto dela havia uma senhora de azul, com rosto. Actually, I won't do. I love to read the Portuguese, and I see some Brazilians here, but just for time, I'll just read the English. So what I did was, next to her was a lady in blue, comma, with a face. She averted her gaze, comma, quickly. On the sidewalk, comma, a woman shoved her son. So this lady in blue with a face, comma, it's a little bit strange. And Giovanni Pontiero, who did the previous translation, he just kind of elided these three really stilted, kind of tripped up moments into a very smooth explanation. Beside her sat a woman in blue with an expression which made Anna avert her gaze rapidly. On the pavement, a mother shook her little boy. And for me, it was this moment, I think, you have to ask yourself too, like, okay, what's the effect? But if you can, sometimes I don't know why she does something, but in this case, I felt like I had a very good idea. If not why, then the effects, like how the form really fit in with the content of the story, where she's breaking down. And so next to her was a lady in blue, take a breath, with a face. And this fact of someone having a face should not be a notable thing. And rosto can mean an expression. It can also just mean face. And, like we say, like you made a face in English. So for me, another area that, like, kind of one of my philosophies for the Lispector was to keep, and for a lot of things, is to keep the literary ambiguity, where you can have a multiple meaning, don't close down meaning. So anyways, this was an example of where it shouldn't have needed all these commas according to Strunk and White, and yet, according to the logic of Clarici, it did. So I'm gonna stop that.
I love what you just said, the just don't close down meaning. I think that's really important. And because so often the differences in two linguistic systems might force us to try to have to make a choice.
I interpret I do it sometimes without realizing it. So sometimes in the revision, I'll say, oh, wait, did I over-translate that?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll go back and I'll often pare down what I was filling in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
we had one question come in already, and then we can keep chatting as more questions come in. But Jeffrey, fellow Cedilla member, asks, many of these components of a philosophy of translation would ideally be determined to some degree before starting the translation in earnest, with some fine-tuning while you're going from draft to draft. I'm curious, have there been moments when you had to completely change some aspect of your philosophy or stance for a book?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and that's why, I really wanted to kind of emphasize that this philosophy, it's really a back and forth process between actually translating and then thinking about what you're doing. And I think, so for Macunaíma, I had a pretty clear idea of what I was going to leave untranslated. Sometimes that's also a big question. Some of these questions you ask yourself is, what are you going to leave untranslated, if anything? How much will you intervene with a stealth gloss? And I think I wasn't quite sure. One thing I had to two things I had to tweak in Macunaíma. I had to tweak how many words I could leave in the original Tupi, which is integrated into Brazilian Portuguese. A lot of Brazilian Portuguese, like especially words for flora and fauna, come from Tupi, which was the major indigenous language on the coast when the Portuguese arrived. And so a lot of the words wouldn't be so difficult for Brazilian readers. And I couldn't just leave everything untranslated. So I kind of had to tweak that, where, I made up my rule. One of the rules was that I understood that part of the role of the Tupi, besides just showing that, Brazilian Portuguese is this whole kind of melting pot, like mix of languages. But one of the roles of it is to kind of show the profusion of the natural world in Brazil, so flora and fauna, and they're kind of list poems. So it'd be like a whole list of trees, a whole list of parrots, and it's not about understanding the words, it's just about the music. And I found late in the process, I found a note from Mario Jindraji to the first person who tried to translate this book into English, saying exactly that, to leave the flora and fauna and to kind of transpose other things. So I think that was kind of a system, like there was a word, I have in this example, jacare. So some things I had to decide, you know, when to leave in the original. Other things I thought, well, jacare, it's a caiman. And it's kind of used in the storybook way. Nobody knows what a caiman is unless you've spent time, you know, in South America or like, you know, about like the Cayman Islands. And even then, you know, you probably don't know what a caiman is. So, you know, it's like kind of like a crocodile. And so I thought, well, okay, it's Western Hemisphere. There are crocodiles, but not really. But this is, I'm trying to translate into this into a kind of American pastiche of an American vernacular. And so I translated it as alligator, which breaks the rule of nature. But, you know, sometimes I had to kind of shift gears into more like a folktale storybook way of approach. And then I was kind of experimenting. So, you know, it's a very oral, very kind of spoken. It's supposed to read like someone just kind of like rambling on, telling a story. And I was experimenting with different forms of American dialects, which is really dicey area because that's like an untranslatable, like you could get into trouble there and it's not equivalent. And he sometimes goes into dialect, but then I thought more about his language. I thought, no, it's more like a vernacular and it's a kind of literary vernacular. So late in the process of revision, I really, you know, I was kind of like, I was toying with dropping like for ing, you know, like swimming with an apostrophe, but I thought, no, that's just too much. But I would do things like smack dab in the middle of the river. So leaning into kind of these colloquialisms that we have in English, but aren't, I stayed away from too many changes of spelling that are a little bit too much. You know, I was looking at Mark Twain, looking at Zora Neale Hurston, but in the end, I thought that this book is from 1926, but I thought that those two, they were a little bit too heavy into dialects the way they were written. So, but that was something that I was really trying to tweak. You know, I didn't really I was going back and forth between my process. So, yeah.
Allison, do you have your hand up?
I do. This is great. It's been wonderful to hear you speak about this, Katrina. Thank you so much. I think also the not closing down ambiguity was very resonant for me. So I appreciate you saying that. But my question that I wanted to ask was about retranslations. Like how, I mean, I think these two big projects that you have undertaken, it's maybe been more clear sort of why you would want to, why retranslations are merited. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about like the question of retranslating, you know, if it's a classic or if it's not a classic, if it's something that, you know, maybe just needs a new translation. Like, what is your opinion about that? Or how would you make that? What are the questions that you would ask?
Yes, so I think, you know, this question of, you know, why do we need new translations it taps into, you know, way of thinking about translation that I very much support, which is, you know, getting away from translation again as a more kind of mechanical, you know, process. Like it's been done once, why do it again? But, you know, thinking about translation as performance, thinking about translation as interpretation, thinking about translation as extending a conversation, you know, finishing a sentence that the author began. And I think that, you know, every translator, you know, we have to be responsible to another text, but we shouldn't be afraid of bringing ourselves, our full selves into our work, because our fingerprints are going to be all over it no matter what. And so I think, you know, it's like, nobody asks why we have, well, sometimes you say, you know, like, why are they remaking that movie? There's no point, like the old one's so good. But, you know, I mean, with Shakespeare plays, they're always redone with a new style. So I think that I love, like, there's always room for another translation because each translation is a reading and each translation kind of gives you another aspect into a certain author. I mean, I don't know if I have, I mean, my philosophy is that, they should happen. But you're asking kind of like how you justify it, or kind of how you would set up your approach to
I was just, I mean, based on your experience, I was just kind of,
Yeah.
what's your opinion about it, or like, I mean, as I understand it, both of these were projects that you were sort of, it wasn't like somebody was like, hey, do you want to translate Makunaima? It was more like, this is something that it was of your own volition, like, and so, yeah, I guess I'm just curious to think about, it's not like you can apply one approach or strategy or philosophy towards it, but yeah, I mean, it's like what merits a new translation, or if you're good at, because we spend so much time we live with these texts, and so do we want to like, okay, retranslate another dead male author, or would you rather translate a living neglected author?
Yeah, of course. And I think, no, I don't want to spend my life translating dead canonical authors. I'm like dying to, pun not intended, but to translate a living author, and just, I got some ideas of what I want to do next, but there's some dead authors I still want to translate. But yeah, I mean, I think, but that's what I mean by, it's important to think about how you're making your choices, what the impact of your trajectory is, what your priorities are. I think it's really important to be translating writers that are not at the center of literary culture, that are not already celebrated in their cultures, and that, or whose stories aren't the ones that we expect, translating in a Western context, like aren't what we expect from the West, And so, but I think for me, the Cleary Spectre and Macunaíma, which is one of the most famous books in Brazil and totally unknown here, that came from being a literature teacher and writing about literature in a comp lit department. So not a Spanish and Portuguese department. I was writing about these texts and wanting to talk about them, wanting to teach them to people who had no access to them. So I think that's, for me, I'm very aware of a certain even baseline. Like, Brazil is not respected on the world stage as it's not known for being a literary culture. And I think it's a real shame. It's known for its music, it's known for its beaches, the rainforest, but part of what drew me to Brazilian literature is that it's such a rich, really weird, just amazing, it's an amazing literature, and that's not how people understand it. And so, and I think to begin to have certain conversations about Brazilian culture and Brazilian literature, something like Macunaíma, you need to have a good translation of it, or at least one that's better than the one that came before, that's more aligned with kind of the spirit of what Mário de Andrade was doing, instead of making it seem like some weird, sexy romp that happened over there. I mean, it opens, like Hero of Our People, it's starting from within, within the place. So, yeah, so that's speaking from my experience.
We've just had an audience question. That's a nice segue from that, from Isabella Torresan. Hello, thank you for all the interesting recommendations. Could you talk a bit more about how you dealt with the geographic mentions in Macunaíma? I'm Brazilian, and when I was reading this book, one of the things that gave me the sense of absurd was the characters' surreal trips. I wonder how someone who's not Brazilian and doesn't know the territory would understand this.
Great question. So I think, again, there's this kind of misconception that a translation is only successful if it stands on its own. If you don't get in there as a translator, and like you shouldn't have to use notes. I don't believe that. I also think that there's a way to add in certain framing without it feeling like homework or without it feeling too academic. And so, I'm writing an introduction, and at one point, trying to explain some of the distances. Theoretically, people can look everything up, but sometimes when I explain, the hero is kind of moving from like way northern Brazil, bounding from northern Brazil down to Argentina in like a single horse chase, and then back up again. I explain it in my introduction. I'm still working on it, but it's like going from like Alaska to Guadalajara. So sometimes you do have to do these kind of comps, and I've had to be really judicious about what I explain. So I really have to just let go of a lot. And I think kind of going forward, I'm trying to explain things that a reader in English that would be very difficult to find out on your own, like some of the indigenous source texts. And yeah, but with Makuneima, I'm breaking some of the rules. Like one of my rules is like I never do cultural transposition. I'm not going to do like le bac as the SATs, or it's like, so, but like here, I do alligator. There's so many colloquialisms that I want to give you like a feeling of the local, and my local is, American. So I have something like fit as a fiddle, and I know that's wrong. There are no fiddles, but I wanted to give a kind of, that kind of folksy flavor that you get with different regional and some archaic terms. So, I want to hear more questions, but can I just show a little bit of what I'm doing? Because I think it might answer some questions about, how you could even mix the domestication and the foreignization in the same passage. So yeah, okay, I'm like, Heather's my master. Let's see. Okay, so I'm gonna skip over the first paragraph. You can see that when the book comes out. But so this is chapter 5, and it's I'm going to show there are kind of these two lists of things, and you can see how I mix things that readers wouldn't know with things that are more familiar. Like I always try to give readers something to hold on to. So it's a little bit hard to read, but I'm just going to read it out loud. The Portuguese is on the left, and this is on the right. And it was the loveliest sight under the sun on that rock. The 3 brothers, one blonde, one red, another black, standing up tall and naked. All the creatures of the forest gaped in awe. The black alligator, the little white-bellied alligator, the great big alligator, the ururau alligator with the big yellow snout. All them gators poked their craggy eyes out the water. In the branches of the ingazeras, the aningas, the mamoranas, the imbaubas, the catuaris, growing along the river bank, the capuchin monkey, the squirrel monkey, the guariba howler, the bugio howler, the spider monkey, the woolly monkey, the bearded saki, the white tufted kairara, all the 40 monkeys of Brazil, all of them gaped drooling with envy. And the sabia song thrushes, the sabia sika, the sabia poca, the sabia una, the sabia piranga, the sabia gonga that never shares its food, the ravine sabia, the minor sabia, the orange tree sabia, the gum tree sabia, all are wonderstruck and forgot to finish their warbling, eloquently clamoring on. Makuneima was furious. He put his hands on his hips and hollered at nature. Ain't nothing to see here. And the literal is nunca viu não, but it's confusing what he means. It could be like a question, like you've never seen it, but basically it just means like, it's supposed to kind of poke a hole in the lyricism, and be kind of like, just, like a funny, like deflation of the moment. And so the natural creatures scattered back to living, and the 3 brothers went on their way once more. And then, so now we get to a list of currency where some of the words, even Brazilians don't know, like no scholar has been able to identify certain words in the list. So that gave me some kind of leeway to kind of do a little bit more, be a little bit freer. However, they were entering the lands of the Igarape Chiete, where bourbon coffee reigned, and the traditional currency was no longer cacao, but instead was called coin, contos, clackers, bits, tokens, shillings, 2 pence, 10 cents, 50 bucks, 90 clams of cash, coppers, pennies, loot, greenbacks, gravy, marbles, mula dough, vouchers, peanuts, frogs, smackaroos, and the like, where you couldn't even get a pair of sock garters for 2,000 cacao beans. Makuneima was very upset. He'd have to bust his tail, him, the hero. He murmured despondently, just so lazy. And that's his catchphrase. So yeah, with the currency, it's all over the place. It's like, where are we? What are we in London? What are we in America? But I wanted to give that kind of sense of like a soup. So
it's fantastic, and the rhythm is so captivating. That you did such a beautiful job of it. So do we have any more, Jeremy, questions from the audience?
We do not have any more questions from the audience. Would anyone like to jump in? This is your chance.
Last chance, or I have a quick one and then the famous final question of the series.
I have a question. Hello. Only because nobody else has one. It's been great so far. So given that the philosophy of each book finds itself as you go along, do you, as a practice, or will you convey some of that to the editors beforehand? I know that there are translators who will basically write a cover letter, essentially, to hand in along with their translation to illuminate some of the things to the editor in advance to kind of, give them a warning, so to speak. Have you done that, or are you planning to do that?
Yes, at every step of the way. I knew that this book would need an explanation, and I knew, and so I've done that for when I pitched it to New Directions and another publisher. I've done it for grant writing, and that's why I did want to write an introduction specifically for this book. I think Emily Wilson's introduction to the Odyssey is a great example. So, another thing I didn't get to say, but a way to kind of figure out your philosophy of translation with individual projects is to read translators' notes. And kind of, something like another one is Lydia Davis's essay on translating Madame Bovary in the Paris Review, and just different interviews with translators. But yeah, I think it's really important. I've found that, maybe some way it's like covering your butt where you're like, well, someone's gonna complain that I did fit as a fiddle, but here, let me tell you why. But I think sometimes there's so many like misconceptions about translation and what it's supposed to be. I think like people have a very narrow view of what translation should be. So I think when you're doing anything experimental, but it's a little bit more for a mainstream audience, it's not like Nightboat or Ugly Duckling Press. Like New Direction's kind of in the middle. It's like for the adventurous, but still kind of like literary reader, like not literary, but like adventurous, but maybe not as adventurous as some of the smaller presses. I think it's important. And I do it so because reviewers have no time. They are not going to Google the stuff in the book. They're not going to Google the history of Brazil. So I think it's important as a translator to frame the text. If it's a text that needs framing, some of them don't, but if it's something that's historical and very culturally based, I do think it's important to give people options. They can always skip it, but I like to give them options for how to get into the book.
We've had a couple of questions come in that hopefully you can answer in a minute or less. Anita DeMarco would like to know if there's any chance the book is bilingual. And Smitha Kurana wonders if you have any tips for writers who are cross-cultural, writing in English for other places and cultures. Any lessons learned from your translation work?
The first one, no, not bilingual. That would be too long. You could just, it's multilingual. That's it. But we're working out whether or not to do a glossary. I want to do it. The publisher, they just don't want too much. So I'm going to see if I can do it in a minimal way, like things that are not Googleable. But I think that could be a really beautiful text in itself. Like you just have a whole list of words in Tupi, and you just have like a whole sense of the forest from another system of classification that's not European. So my argument is like, I want to make it a creative work in itself. And I think someone who's, done something like that is Aaron Murray in Paraguayan Sea by Wilson Bueno. It's actually Wilson Bueno's glossary, but I think that's an example of a kind of experimental text that's multilingual, that does a lot of, has interesting solutions. The other question, it was about just
writing in English as a cross-cultural writer about other places and cultures. And if translation.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. And this is something that came up last time. I think you have to get really clear with yourself. This is your philosophy: is what am I going to translate culturally, and what am I going to just leave to the reader? And I think you will start to have a sense. I think it's just as much a question for writers as translators. It's like, how important is it for the reader to know the word in this moment? Sometimes you want like the humor to work, and in that case I'll add a gloss, because you don't want to expect people to look things up. It breaks momentum. So sometimes you have to think, well, should I do a gloss here? But other times you think, well, there are different contextual elements that I can put in, especially as a writer, you have more control. you can kind of break the readers into a particular phrase or concept through just kind of usage in the text. The text becomes its own dictionary, its own context. But I think it's important to ask yourself those questions, because you don't need to translate everything. But I also think there's certain things where you have to think about your audience and how you want to connect to them and in what way. So if you want to connect to them, then you're probably going to have to do a little bit more explanatory work. So.
And I guess now comes the final question. What would an ideal future of translation look like to you?
So I didn't get to look at other people's responses. Mine are not original answers, because I know it's like everyone wants this. Like the number one, Alex Zucker is here, better pay for translators. We can't unionize, we can't collude, but we can share information. Daniel Hahn shares his rates on his website, but I really want a world in which literary translators can make a living on literary translation alone. It's so hard, and I think it's so much work, and it's there's so little pay. Second is just more diversity in what gets translated. I mean, you're talking about an English context, what gets translated into English, from whom, and also I think it's been really great, like a growing discussion about more translators of color in a US and an Anglo context. So I think, yeah, I would just like to see more different kinds of people translating. But I think the one that's related to this talk is really, I would like to see a more expansive vision of what translation is and can be. I think like we're still in this like medieval craftsman territory, and I want us to be the Renaissance artists. I think we are, but I think just in terms of how people think about translation, it's still in this very narrow view of kind of like comparing word for word the text and the original, or even assuming that there's a stable original. So yeah, I mean, I mentioned this before, but I would just love to see more experimental translations and more thinking about translation. I love translation metaphors, like translation as, I guess there's similes with, in the general family of metaphors, but translation as performance, translation as interpretation. I always make my students in my workshops come up with, kind of look for different metaphors of translation, and then we come up with a list at the end of the semester, and they get like, someone was like, translation is like walking and something is like ill-fitting high heels down a city block, and like someone else's heels. Yeah, so those are my hopes and dreams.
Those are fantastic. That image will stay with me for a long time. the discomfort and adventure of translation.
And hello to my students. I see some here. And thank you to everyone for coming. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. That's all the time we have for today. But thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you again to the Center for Fiction for hosting these clinics. And Katrina, that was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Translation clinics take place on the third Thursday of every month. Please sign up with the Center for Fiction to be notified of upcoming events. Next month, Rajiv Moabir will talk with Sean Gaspar Bai about strategies for dislocating entrenched sites of power in and through translation. So that promises to be really good. The registration link is available in the chat and also on the website for the Center for Fiction. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.